Hi, I'm David Henry from Reuters. Good evening, good afternoon. So hopefully from that last panel, y'all got an idea of where the economy is going. And this next panel, we've got some people who are going to tell us what the current administration should do about it. And to start with, we have Jason Furman, and his job title makes him perfect for this. He's professor of the practice of economic policy at Harvard. And he actually practiced economic policy for 8 years as a top economic advisor to President Biden's former boss, Barack Obama. And then we're going to hear from Bruce Greenwald, a professor of finance and asset management at Columbia. And among his expertise includes how government policies can impact economic productivity. And Bruce consistently wins accolades from Columbia students for his teaching, and so I expect he's going to prod us all to think a little bit beyond the conventional wisdom. And then we have Wray from the Levy Institute, and a professor of economics at Bard College, and his books include Why Minsky Matters, which to me shows how much we might learn from maverick economists. So, Jason, if you're there, would you tell us what you see going on and what this administration is doing right, wrong, or failing to address?
Great. It's great to be at this conference. The last time I was there, I was talking about the great moderation. There's been some immoderation since then, but hopefully we're going to be back on track really soon. I'm going to do 3 topics. I know we just covered the short run, but I can't help myself. Want to give you my perspective quickly, but then get to the longer run, focusing on the fiscal side. A hot or an overheating economy. This is the question that is on everyone's mind. Everyone is debating it right now. Stepping back, I think the United States should feel quite good about its economic response. It had among the smallest contractions through the end of 2020, and it's the only economy that the OECD expects will be above what it thought prior to COVID by the end of the year. That's a forecast, but the inadequate fiscal support in Europe is likely to leave Europe about a year behind the United States in terms of its economic recovery, possibly even permanently behind the United States. So big picture, something quite good. The labor market is still very far from recovered. We're 11 million jobs short of trend, and the employment population rate is well below where it was prior to all of this. Nevertheless, I think there is a substantial amount of uncertainty around what fraction of this shortfall is due to the supply of workers or the demand for workers. And there's a lot of evidence to support a demand interpretation. This is the job opening rate. It's just through March. If you saw it through April, it would be higher still. Far and away the highest job openings that we've ever seen since 2000, at least, when we started recording these numbers. If you look at the number of job openings per unemployed worker, that is below where it was just prior to the pandemic, but similar to where it was around 2017. We often referee debates about supply versus demand by looking at prices, or in this case, looking at wages. And wage growth in this experience is very different from what you saw in the past. Normally, wage growth goes down following recessions. Here, it has been flat and held up. Moreover, the fastest wage growth is for the first quartile of the distribution, very different from what we saw last time around. So the labor market, judged by the wage data, looks just as hot, if not hotter, than it did in 2019. Judged by flows, looks hot. Judged by employment, there's a lot to go. I think the most likely scenario is that more people start to want to work as vaccines are deployed, as schools come back, and as unemployment insurance benefits expire, and at the same time more jobs become available. That's the happy scenario. There's some unhappy scenarios that I place non-trivial weight on as well. Overall, though, the most important is that inflation expectations, at least for now, are well anchored. This is an index the Fed looks at. It's 21 different measures, market, forecasters and the public. That measure, the latest as extended by Goldman Sachs, is basically right around 2%. And really importantly, if this changes, it's the Fed's responsibility to keep it that way. The Fed has tools. The Fed, its tools aren't perfect, but we expect them to do it. This is not something that Congress thinks of as its job. It's not something Congress should think of as its job. It's not something Congress is not going to go out and raise taxes or cut spending just because inflation is getting out of control. So best guess, no overheating, but a lot of risk, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of cloudy things. Now let's look at the agenda going forward. And now I'm going to stop talking about inflation. Fiscal measures, inflation isn't a good prism for thinking about this going forward for 3 reasons. First of all, the numbers. The fiscal measures are more than 10% of GDP in 2021 alone. The sum total of the Biden plans maxes out at about 1% of GDP in net cost. You can debate the multipliers on the different parts of the plan. I don't think we know enough to have enough confidence in those estimates. So roughly speaking, it's relatively close to neutral. Moreover, the Fed has a long window. They can do things years and years in advance if they feel they need to control the inflation. And these plans expand the supply side of the economy, not the demand side. So wouldn't debate inflation, would debate what we think of the individual elements and the issue of fiscal sustainability, which I'll come back to. So what does the agenda include? It's about $4.5 trillion of stuff. Physical infrastructure being the largest, green investments the second largest, manufacturing third, caregiving, fourth, caregiving, education, poverty, and paid leave. Sorry, poverty and paid leave being the largest, which is exciting and important. I'll come back to that. And then there's a set of tax increases, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. About half of them on the corporate side, half of them on the individual side, and in the individual side, about half of those are better enforcement. So taxes under the Biden plan are not very high in historical perspective. The blue line is current law. The orange line is under the plan. I'm just showing you the jobs plan and the family plan. He proposed additional tax increases in the budget, in the campaign. Those may show up in a budget. I don't know. So these are the tax increases proposed to date. So it puts it sort of well within where taxes have been over the last 60 years. What's different is who the taxes are collected from. The tax rate on the top 1% of households would be the highest it's been since at least 1979, which is as far back as I have data that I'm comfortable with and think is comparable. And the reason that these taxes go up this much is to make up for the fact that taxes have gone down on the middle class and on lower income households. We've seen a trend since 1979 of lower taxes for the middle 3 quintiles, much lower taxes for the lowest quintile. I don't have a good estimate for those under the Biden plan, but they'd both be a bit lower than the dots you see there. The top 1% goes up to make up for it. So you want to think of the Biden plan as raising a similar amount of revenue that's been raised in the past. It raises it on the top to make up for the fact that revenue has gone down on the bottom. I should say that and just to look at the statutory corporate rates, the US rate would go up, including state and local. Oh, this one, sorry, this is central. I thought I'd included state and local. Anyway, the US one would go up. France is in the process of lowering its rates. The UK is in the process of raising them. Overall, the United States would be towards the upper end of the G7 economies. But the Biden proposal also includes an international minimum tax and other tax measures that would enable you to have more of a wedge between tax rates in the United States and other countries. What's remarkable is that with all these tax changes, the estimates on economic growth are almost imperceptible. These are all the estimates I'm aware of. The American Enterprise Institute is a right-leaning think tank. The National Association of Manufacturers is a interest group. Penn Wharton Budget Model, I think they're quite straight about things. Tax Foundation, a right-leaning think tank. Tax Policy Center, pretty centrist. They're estimating different subsets of the proposal. They estimated them at different points in time, but under the AEI model, instead of the growth rate being 2.2, it would be 2.2. Under the one put out by the National Association of Manufacturers as an argument against the Biden plan, they were arguing against the Biden plan. They were saying the Biden plan was a bad idea. They were saying the growth, instead of being 2.0, would be 2.0. And it goes on. Now, if I showed you the second and third decimal places, you'd start to see some differences. They do have some small negative effects on growth, but they're so small that you wouldn't see them in the first decimal place of the annual growth rate over the next decade. So in some sense, the stakes, this is the stakes in terms of growth of the tax debate, are smaller than what one would think. I think the issue in the tax debate is that the tax changes are, broadly speaking, good. There are places you could go even higher on high-income households. For example, you could have a higher tax rate, which he hasn't proposed. You could do more to above 39.6, higher than we've had historically, and you could do more to get it passed through income. So I think there's more room in high-income households than he's tapped. There still isn't enough room to get us everywhere to where we'd want to go, or at least to where I would want to go. And so ultimately, this downward ratchet of taxes on the bottom 99% of Americans is going to need to at least be partly reversed. Otherwise, you'll basically run out of revenue you can get on the top 1%. There's a lot more there before we get to that point, but we will at some point get to that point. In terms of spending, here is federal non-interest outlays under the plan. They're up a little bit over the next decade. And just to give some rough impressions, the poverty and paid leave parts of the plan, the ones that center on humans and the family plan, that to me is the highest value. It's basically guaranteed good because you're giving money to people that really need it. And there's a lot of evidence that that money is really an investment that results in higher outcomes in the future in terms of likelihood of being employed, higher wages, lower chance of being incarcerated, and the like. The education agenda, especially the preschool part of it, falls under that same heading. The green investments, I think many of them are quite good and quite important given climate change, but I worry that, for example, giving subsidies to electric vehicle owners is going to give a lot of money to higher income households that would have bought their electric vehicles anyway. So it doesn't have a great distribution, doesn't have a great bang for the buck in terms of carbon emissions. I have much more mixed feelings about manufacturing, the manufacturing proposals, and the other ones vary. We could talk about them more in the Q&A. But I want to do one last topic, which is rethinking of fiscal policy. This is a large agenda in terms of gross size. It also, over the next decade, would have more spending than is collected in taxes, so it would add to the baseline deficit. And the baseline deficit is already much higher than it's been historically. As a result, the US debt held by the public it rose in the financial crisis, it rose again in COVID, and it would stabilize at about 120% of GDP. Now, that's not spiraling out of control, that's roughly a plateau. And the question is, should we be worried about this? Should we be trying to do this? Should we not be worried about that? Should we be trying to stabilize it here? Which of these paths are the right paths, and how to think about it? The way we want to think about that has changed a decent amount. And the reason it's changed a decent amount is that interest rates have fallen. They've fallen across all the advanced economies for decades, a decline that precedes the financial crisis, that you saw even at or near full employment prior to the COVID crisis. Just to look at the United States, here's the 10-year, and it is very likely to rise. But CBO forecasts that rise to 3.3. Markets are expecting it to rise to 2.7. Under any of those, it would still be very low compared to where it's been for the last 60 years. These lower interest rates are not a timeless truth. They're a parameter in the economy. They're a structural change, and they're a structural change that should lead us to update our thinking. It creates challenges, constraints on conventional monetary policy. It's hard to lower interest rates below or much below zero. Increased financial stability risks as people reach for yield. Investors take greater risks to make up for the lower return, and it's a symptom of chronic demand shortfalls. But it does open up a lot of opportunities. Fiscal expansions are more potent, and you may have crowd in when you're not worried about interest rates. More public investments are justified economically and even partially or fully pay for themselves. We know that private investment projects aren't as good as they used to be, as evidenced by low interest rates. The marginal public investment project, there's no reason to think that's gotten any worse. And finally, a higher level of debt is optimal or sustainable, just to go back to that question I had before in terms of the debt levels. So let's unpack that. I think that the debt level itself is the wrong question to be asking. Debt, should it be stable at 30, 80, 100, 1,000? Who knows? Now, there are some, and I think Randall's probably in the school, that aren't worried at all about debt sustainability. I think we have to ask questions about debt sustainability. A 1,000% debt to GDP ratio wouldn't work. Now, it works on paper. As long as the debt to GDP stabilizes at any finite value, that works for debt sustainability. That is true. If R is less than G, then any primary deficit, no matter how big it is, will result in the economy asymptoting to a finite value for debt to GDP. That's also true. This might lead one to think we don't need to worry about debt sustainability as a concern at all, that we can just think about factors like inflation. But that's not correct, because debt raises interest rates. And you can't do your debt sustainability analysis with an exogenous interest rate. If the debt goes up a lot, then R will go up. And then R won't be less than G anymore. So the more you try to exploit this, the less true it becomes. So what's the right debt to GDP ratio? Well, I think that's the wrong question. Debt is a stock. It's measured at a point in time. GDP is a flow. It's measured over a period of time. What's the US GDP? Well, the US GDP yesterday was, I don't know, a couple $100 billion. The US GDP last month was about $2 trillion. The GDP over the last year was around $20 trillion. You get different numbers for GDP depending on how much time you measure it over. And that matters. If you looked at debt for monthly GDP, it's 1,000%. Debt over a decade's GDP, it's 12%. This isn't a parlor trick. This is motivating the debt over the net present value of future GDP, which is probably the best way to look at it of any of these numbers, is 0.6%. What does that say? We could raise taxes or cut spending by 0.6% of GDP and fully pay off the debt over an infinite horizon. That's a roughly 1 percentage point increase in all tax rates, could retire the debt. I'm not saying we should retire the debt. That isn't a goal. That's just a conceptual frame. Now, this stock perspective that I was just using gives you a very different way to think about the America's fiscal position. America's fiscal position looks better measured as debt to GDP in 2004 than 2020. But when you take into account the decline in interest rates, it's actually easier to repay your debt over time. And so that debt as a percentage of infinite horizon GDP has stayed about the same at roughly 0.5%. So the fiscal position of the United States is similar to what it was In 2004, higher debt and lower interest rates. You see the same thing with the flow perspective, which I prefer. Debt goes up, debt service goes down, and this is real debt service as a share of GDP. So finally, we'll just end on an illustrative fiscal plan. $2 trillion of unpaid for investment, children, education, climate, traditional infrastructure, etc. Not limiting myself to those. Additional investments and support paid for with tax increases on high-income corporations and health reforms. And then you eventually do Social Security reform to ensure solvency, ideally through higher revenue. What would this look like? If you look at real debt service, instead of the baseline where debt is rising to at 222% of GDP and real debt service is in unprecedented territory, you're roughly stabilizing at around 150% of GDP, at around 2% of GDP in real net interest payments. I think that is a very feasible place to aim for, but would need to update depending on what happens to interest rates over time. So in some would say, I have some worries about overheating this year. I think that's not the dominant probability, but I have some worries. Insofar as I'm calm and relaxed, it's because I think the Fed should and will act to deal with it. Over the medium term, I wouldn't think about inflation at all. In the context of this plan, I would think about whether the investments are good, and by and large they are. I would think about whether the revenue raisers are good, and I think by and large they're progressive, would have relatively small impact on growth, so by and large they are. And I would ask a question of, is it consistent with a fiscally sustainable framework? And broadly speaking, I think there is more room for deficit spending over the next decade than President Biden thinks there is, and he could do more above and beyond the pay-fors he's proposed, consistent with a relatively sustainable fiscal course, but one that would need to be revisited over time depending on circumstances. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. Bruce?
Yeah, I think, can you all hear me? Because I'm getting sort of Jason fading in and out, but I'll go ahead and talk anyway, because I don't really care whether anybody can hear me or not. I'll just talk to myself if you lose me. So what I would like to do is talk about this from a very different perspective than Jason's, and then maybe come back at the end to talk a little bit about the short term here. I think that the problem of government policy is very importantly determined by what's going on in the economy. And I think that what's going on in the economy is a global phenomenon. And I think it's a very unhappy economic situation. And I think it's a very unhappy economic situation, especially in contrast to the past, because what we're seeing and what we've been seeing for a long time, and therefore none of this is going to be new news, I think, to anybody, is that we are seeing a transition from manufacturing, which now is, I think, below, well, it's certainly below 10% of the US labor force. It's certainly going down in that direction for everybody else, including, by the way, the Chinese, and a rise of a service economy. And that transition has very, very important consequences. The first and most obvious is on productivity growth. That services take place in small decentralized institutions, just like agriculture did in the early days, and manufacturing takes place in large set of centralized institutions. And the vast majority of productivity growth, and this is probably increasing, not decreasing over time, is basically the solo residual. It really is just constant attention to process improvement and learning that goes on, and active application of management and engineering talent is a lot easier in large centralized institutions than in small decentralized ones. Now, in the United States, we were historically very fortunate because the Agricultural Extension Service and the land grant colleges enabled us really to do that kind of activity at a fairly large scale for agriculture, but nothing like that exists for services. So I think the first thing that we're living with, and by the way, because we have larger service firms with larger scale in almost all the big service industries, we're probably in better shape, certainly than the Europeans in terms of productivity growth. But we're not going to see the kind of 3, 4, 5% productivity growth that you see in the transition from agriculture to manufacturing. And I think that's something that's got to be thought about and it's got to be dealt with because it's not going to go away. And I think trying to save manufacturing jobs is just a joke. I mean, it's not, people have been talking about it for years and manufacturing employment has gone consistently down. The second thing I think that's important about the transition to services that you have to deal with is that service jobs tend to be done individually. The big service sectors you can think of like education and medical care, it's obvious that doctors tend to work individually, much more so than factory workers work individually. When people work individually, and we know this from the old George Stigler data, the distribution of income gets much more uneven. So you have, when he looked at individual legal practitioners, you had a much wider distribution than you did among the incomes of lawyers in large law firms. And again, I don't see that that's going to change. I mean, you've seen it actually infect institutions like universities that had much flatter distributions of income, but now that people tend to get rated, they tend to work individually, they tend to have individual reputations and the ability to negotiate, you're seeing a lot more individual income determination there, and that's not going to change. So at the same time that you're seeing a dramatic slowdown in the rise in overall incomes, you're seeing a continuing, and again, there's no new news about this, you're seeing a continuing deterioration in low level incomes and a deterioration in the measured distribution of income that you're going to have to deal with. And the third problem is one that surprisingly has gotten relatively little attention, but I think especially in terms of the short-term reaction is important. If you look at profitability of US business, but global business too, from roughly 1950, when you get over the sort of immediate aftermath of the Second World War, through 1990, what you see is steadily declining profitability. And what's going on is that markets that at the beginning of that period are national markets, so General Motors dominates the US, British car companies dominate Britain, and so on, those markets globalize. Big markets tend to be markets that no individual firm can dominate. They tend to be markets without barriers to entry, and they tend therefore to be increasingly competitive and increasingly low profit markets. Unfortunately, that's not what happens in services. Services are locally produced and consumed overwhelmingly, and you're going from big global markets to necessarily local markets. At the same time, technology has probably exacerbated that trend because what enables people to do is combine sort of niche products like Google doing search and Microsoft doing operating systems and Intel doing only CPU chips into larger systems, in contrast to what happened in the old days where companies like, so you've got smaller niche markets in sort of product geography, and you've got smaller markets in physical geography because of services. The consequence of that is those markets can be dominated by individual firms, and you get significant increases in barriers to entry. To give you a simple calculation, if you want to know sort of how, and this is sort of Warren Buffett or investing language, how wide the moat is in a market, what you have to start with is what's the minimum sustainable scale you have to get to as a fraction of the market. So it's what's the minimum sustainable market share. And for small markets, that number is going to be a lot higher than for big markets. And the second thing, and this is also something that's been affected by the trend of services, is that it's how hard is it to acquire that share. So to give you an example, if you look at local markets for caffeinated soft drink distribution, you really have to get to about 20 to 25% share in order to be viable, to have the infrastructure for distribution and for bottling. That market share changes hands at about 0.2% a year in contested competitive environments. That means a new entrant would take 125 years to get to scale. And those kinds of calculations are showing increasing barriers to entry across economies as these changes take place. And in particular, what you've seen, and I'm surprised again that it's not as widely remarked on as it should be, and it's why things like the Shiller ratios don't necessarily mean what they mean in the past, is that the profit share has gone up from about 8.5% in the late 90s to something like 13%, 13.5%, and conceivably in the wake of COVID, even more than that today. So you've got a combination of decreasing productivity growth, you've got increasing labor inequality, and you've got increasing sort of profits at the expense of labor income, and none of that seems likely to go away. And those are structural changes that I think you're going to have to deal with. And I see nothing in anything that the administration is doing that's going to improve that. And in terms of the long-run productivity growth, the history is quite clear that the more the government interferes or the more unstable a policy environment, the slower productivity growth is, because there's a diversion of sort of management talent to coping with those situations and coping with my co-author and Jason's former boss, Joe Stiglitz, refers to as rent seeking at the expense of actual productivity growth. So that making big changes without having a sense of where you're going with those changes, I think is a recipe for very significant slowdown in productivity growth, way beyond the order of the things that Jason was talking about. To give you an idea of that, when Obama went to work with his pen and telephone in his second term, productivity growth fell by about 1% a year. And at a 2% productivity growth rate, that is a very substantial growth. So I think the first thing that you have to worry about with policy is having a sense as to a laundry list of things that you want to do to meet certain policy goals, where there's going to be a process of very expensive negotiation. And I think what that's going to do is actually cause growth to deteriorate further. The second thing I think you have to worry about in this environment is that when productivity growth was 3 to 4 or 5% a year, and this is clearly much more of an issue in Europe, you can go ahead and capture a fair amount of that for government purposes. And you don't have to be particularly careful about how you spend the money. I think in Europe, and you see it really in both voting patterns and the kind of disorder you have with the Gilets jaunes in France, as the growth in underlying economic incomes has slowed down, people are much less receptive to the idea of giving money to the government. And I think an emphasis in that environment on government operation is something that you want to care about a lot. I mean, you expropriate money from anybody, you really ought to use it. And there's no sense vibrance. And there we have a lot of experience that's fairly gross experience. So over the course of the 70s and early 80s, educational expenditures per pupil basically double, and it's an exogenous change. And there is zero change in educational attainment. So in educational performance, there's no change. So I think that if you're going, it's not really an issue of the deficit so much as if the government is going to expropriate more money and spend more money. I think what you've got to think about is world is much slower and very worthwhile. So I think that the problems, and I'll stop here, really are that these are not policies that in any sense address the underlying conditions that are in any sense these 10-year growth rates. They're clearly not going to be just the result of policies of the Biden administration, that they're going to be as a result of longer term political and government evolution. And I don't see any change in that direction at all, which I think is a fairly sad contrast to what was done in the administration. So
Bruce, we've lost you. Randy, if you have a chance to step in, that might be good.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I think we missed some of his most important comments. Whoops. Hold it. Get out of here. I'm trying to share the screen. Sorry. Take a second. Okay, so I'm also going to be looking at the proposals, but I'm going to focus on the tax side. Like Jason, I like a lot of the proposals. And let me also just preface this by saying I'm also not worried about inflation, but I'm going to talk about inflation anyway, because a lot of people are. And you'll see why. I think that we should be raising taxes if there is an inflation danger. Otherwise, I don't see the point. Unlike the earlier COVID relief packages and also the Trump and Bush Jr. tax cuts and the tax cuts all the way back to Ronald Reagan, as Bob was saying earlier today, the Biden and Yellen administration is insisting on soup's worth of tax hikes, corporate profits, an extra tax on high profit corporations, taxes on high earners, taxes on high wealth, and a hike of the capital gains tax. Yellen, just a couple of days ago, argued that we do need fiscal space to be able to address emergencies. We don't want to use up all of that space. And over the long run, deficits need to be contained to keep our federal finances on a sustainable basis. So I believe we should pay for these historic investments. Okay, what do we know about sovereign government finance? There is no such thing as fiscal space in financial terms. Federal government spending is paid for when the Treasury cuts a check, the Fed credits bank reserves, and banks credit the deposit account of the recipient. And this is done no matter what the budgetary outcome turns out to be. Outcomes are ex post. We do the adding up later at the end of the year, typically. Budgetary outcomes are not discretionary. They depend on economic performance, and they depend on the other sectoral balances, as Michaelis was talking about earlier. Following Wynne Godley, the government's deficit is identically equal to the sum of the other two surpluses, the domestic private sector and the net foreign surplus. So the deficit is not a policy choice. It is not under control of those who set the budget and the tax rates. The federal government finally can make all payments as they come due. Its balance is always sustainable. Yes, even if the debt ratio goes to 1,000%, it is still sustainable. Now, in Q&A, I can provide an answer as to why it's not likely to go to 1,000%. But again, it's not within the control of the administration to determine what the size of the deficit will be. Resources, not finance, is the true constraint. Tackling multiple pandemics comes down to mobilizing the unemployed resources, shifting those who are already employed, and creating new ones. How do we shift them? We use taxes, postpone consumption, patriotic saving, and if we need to, rationing and regulations. As Charles Goodhart said this morning, this is what we did in World War II. This is how you manage to shift the resources to the government sector. Spending then allocates the resources as desired to achieve the public purpose. Taxing releases resources for pursuit of the public purpose. As Beardsley Rummel said at the end of World War II, he was a New Dealer, chairman of the New York Fed, father of the income tax withholding. The war has taught us that taxes are obsolete as a source of revenue. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need taxes. Taxes serve to remove private demand to free resources for government programs. They reduce inequality of income and wealth. They can be used to distribute costs to the beneficiaries of government programs, and they can be used to punish bad behavior or encourage good behavior. In all of this, he really was following the Musgraves, who make very similar arguments in the most commonly used public finance textbook. So resources, not finance, is the true constraint. Tackling multiple pandemics, which is what we face. I know COVID was dismissed a little bit by Charles Goodhart as saying this is a minor little blip, but the fact is we face a large number of pandemics, not just a health pandemic. It comes down to mobilizing unemployed resources, shifting those already employed, and, oops, sorry, went the wrong way. To shift resources from public to the public use. Taxes need to reduce private spending. How do the kinds of taxes typically favored by progressives measure up on this score? How many dollars have to be taxed to reduce spending by $1? The corporate tax, it's widely agreed, can be shifted forward to consumers, backward to workers, and also to shareholders. Okay, well, shifting forward to consumers is likely to be inflationary. Exactly how much is shifted forward is controversial. I think that it's probably more than what most people believe, as I believe most taxes are shifted to consumers. Backward to workers, whether or not that's going to be inflationary or deflationary is hard to determine. And to shareholders, well, 40% of those shareholders are foreigners, 35% are institutions. It's hard to see how that is going to make a significant reduction in domestic spending. Capital gains taxes, New York Times just had a piece arguing that the evidence is that it has no impact on the stock market. If it's not influencing the spending on stocks, I don't know how much is going to reduce spending on output. A millionaire's income tax, what's the propensity to spend of millionaires? A billionaire wealth tax, Elizabeth Warren proposed that, and on her campaign website, she said, look, don't worry, it's not gonna hurt. Well, if it doesn't hurt, it's not gonna reduce spending. High-speed trading tax, I can't understand the logic of that. How is that gonna reduce spending? So I think none of these progressive, popular tax increases measures up as reducing private use of domestic resources. What would work? Well, a broad-based but progressive taxes on consumption or income that's likely to be consumed are the most effective, with an exemption for those with the lowest incomes. There are conflicting goals of tax pay-fors. You want to balance the budget. You want to fight inflation. You want to reduce inequality. Those are conflicting. Pay-fors match spending and tax revenue. But to control inflation, you want to match the tax take to the desired reduction of private spending. That could be less than program spending, but it's likely to be very much more, especially if it's aimed at high income individuals. And remember, Biden has promised not to increase taxes by $1 for anyone earning under $400,000. So there's no reason to expect that the ideal level is spending equals tax revenue. In other words, the whole notion of pay for is inconsistent with using taxes to reduce demand. You're more likely to need, say, $10 of revenue from high earners to reduce spending by $1. The Biden plan also has proposed 15 years of taxes to pay for 8 years of spending. Okay, well, first, how is that paid for? Why not 25 years, 125 years, an indefinite future? How is that paid for? Why withdraw demand for 7 years after the government has stopped much of the spending when the disinflationary or even deflationary forces start to hit the economy because the government has ramped down its spending on, especially on the infrastructure and so on? The tax plan fails to target inequality. Why would a balanced budget increase of taxes coincide with the desired reduction of inequality? There's no reason to believe that it would. And I think as proposed, it will not. So what's the alternative approach? A functional approach to taxes. And so we have recommended for the Green New Deal a temporary surcharge in the form of broad-based tax with generous exemptions. And the purpose is to reduce resource use as the infrastructure is put in place, human and capital, and then boost consumption once the nation's capacity has been increased. For example, by ramping up Social Security payments. So my recommendations for reforming Social Security are very different from Jason's. And we could begin that, say, in 5 years, okay, before we start to phase out the spending. High marginal tax rates on income and wealth to reduce inequality. How high? Well, it's got to hurt, in spite of what Warren promised. Biden's tax hikes raised the average tax rate to about 30%. The data I saw, Jason's data was a little bit higher. Okay, I'll accept that. But you need a confiscatory marginal rate to reduce inequality. AOC proposed 70%. Maybe that's not even high enough. Ideally, you want the wealth and high income tax to hurt so much that no revenue is raised at all. We'll need additional policies to increase income and wealth at the bottom. So we need to reduce the income at the top, but we've got to raise the income at the bottom. A job guarantee with generous wage and benefits. And to deal with our pandemic of racial inequality, we need reparations payments and or baby bonds as proposed by Sandy and Derek. Okay, is it realistic to expect inflation? So I have been talking about using taxes to fight inflation. Is it realistic? And we've had several other presentations today arguing that it's not, although we have had a couple that do fear inflation. So let's tackle the notion that maybe it's going to be inflationary. Some people pointed to the recent hiccup in longer maturity treasuries as evidence that the market expects inflation. Okay, it's true that they have gone up substantially, but securities prices were too high anyway. Financial assets are overpriced across the whole range of financial assets. Treasuries earned just 1% last summer. From either the concept of duration or Keynes's square rule, the potential capital losses of an interest rate hike swamp any earnings, so they had to go up, and they've got to remain above 2%. The Fed isn't going to practice ZIRP for everyone. Everybody knows that. Rates will go up eventually, so the long-term rates had to come up. Expectations have to converge eventually to reality, and that means asset prices are going to fall. Several other people have talked about the speculative furor going on. Inflation, as we once knew it, is gone, and it's time that we get over it. Here's the recent data. This is looking in more detail. The green is transportation, so that swings with oil prices. The yellow is imputed rental. You can see those two items are the story of recent disinflation and of inflation. And neither of those is likely to be affected very much by ramping up US economic performance, especially as we phase out fossil fuel use. We won't need to worry about that green part anymore. Government debt does not cause inflation. I think somebody presented a graph similar to this before. As the debt ratio climbs, the inflation rate comes down. Government debt does not push up interest rates. Again, as the debt ratio goes up, the interest rates come down. What this graph shows, I think, is pretty clearly, we face only one bond vigilante, and that vigilante has promised us they're not going to raise interest rates for at least 2 more years. So until the Fed raises interest rates, the interest rates are going to be kept low. Can we keep the interest rate permanently below the growth rate? Of course we can. This is completely within the scope of monetary policy. Finally, I want to conclude with a infrastructure project that was proposed by Henry Ford back in 1921, and the New York Times had a very nice interview of Thomas Edison. So his answer, let us suppose for a moment that Congress follows his proposal. Personally, I don't think Congress has the imagination enough to do it, but let us suppose that it does. That sounds very familiar, right? The required sum is authorized, say $30 million. The bills are issued directly by the government, as all money ought to be. When these bills have answered the purpose of building and completing Muscle Shoals, they will be retired by the earnings of the power dam. That is, the people of the United States will have all that they put into Muscle Shoals and all they can take out for centuries, the endless wealth-making water power of that great Tennessee River with no tax and no increase of the national debt. So much of the Build Back Better is going to go toward improving the nation's productivity. Bruce might be skeptical, okay? US peak capacity utilization is on a downward trend. I had a graph very similar to one that I think Michaela showed. Spending on the Build Back Better programs will raise aggregate demand, increase utilization, and possibly pressure some prices in the short run. Ultimately, it's going to increase capacity and productivity. As the spending winds down, we're going to face disinflation and possibly deflation and a return to secular stagnation. So we're going to need to ramp up spending to avoid that. We need to take the approach of Wagner's Law, Vader and Walker, or Hyman Minsky, and that is the view that government spending should act like a ratchet, not countercyclically. You increase spending in a downturn to move toward full employment and encourage investment, and then you continue to increase trend spending on a pace with GDP in order to utilize the capacity that's been generated. That way you avoid the DOMAR problem. So what we're going to need to do is add to the Biden plan a job guarantee program, enhance Social Security. I don't mean increase taxes, I mean increase the benefits, and a bottom-up policy more generally. I will stop. Thank you.
Okay, Jason and Randy, I've got one question for you before I ask those of you on the panel for questions for one another. The thing about political reality, Jason, because we've got a Republican Party that doesn't seem to be moved by polls showing widespread support for increasing taxes on the rich. So what here in the Biden plan is realistic, particularly in taxes?
I don't know. The proposals in the plan, as you noted in your question, are broadly popular with the public. I am sure you can get 97% of the Democratic Party to support them. You need to get 100% of the Democratic Party to support them, and I hope you can get that, but I don't know for sure. Some of them are easier, raising the top rate from 37 to 39.6. People are very comfortable with that. People are comfortable raising the corporate rate from 21 to 25. There's more debate when you go above 25. The capital gains proposal is one that has run into some initial resistance and the like. I don't think the amount that you spend needs to be constrained by the amount that you can raise in taxes. In fact, I found myself, I think, thinking there's more fiscal space. I know Randall doesn't like the concept of fiscal space, but thinking more of this can be unpaid for over the next decade, that we can run larger deficits over the next decade. But there's a limit. And so if you start throwing out some of the offsets, even if you're willing to have, an extra 2 trillion above and beyond the offsets, you're going to be cutting down on some of the things and investments and the like. And, they're going to have to decide, how binding the budget constraint is. I hope it isn't overly binding, and how to expand the budget constraint as much as possible. Ultimately, Congress does choose what the deficit and debt path is. Plus or minus, depending on economic circumstances. And, there's no successful progressive country that's gotten there on the basis of anything other than raising revenue. And so, I hope to see that happen.
Randy,
Well,
do you have a view on what's realistic tax-wise?
well, I
Me?
mean, we know.
Randall, go ahead.
Oh, we know for certain the Republicans have said there is no chance. They are not going to support this. It's funny that we've done 5 trillion with no pay-fors, no problem, no bad results from this. And Republicans don't play the pay-for game. So it's just so curious to me that Democrats want to link wildly popular spending programs to tax hikes that are going to be extremely difficult and going to cause, I think, my prediction is, cause the Democrats to peel things off and drop them. Okay, and we're going to end up with much less spending than what we need.
Bruce, you got an opinion?
Well, I mean, I'm just aghast at this wildly popular spending programs. I mean, let's start with Europe, where they've actually spent the money. The governments in Europe basically take 50 cents of every dollar. If you ask yourself, what do you get for that 50 cents in Europe? Well, you get some medical care. You get some education, although because they have increasingly few children, that's a smaller and smaller fraction of what goes on. What do you get for the 50% that they get to spend themselves? You get food, you get housing, you get clothing, you get entertainment, you get vacations. I don't see where that's a fair trade-off. I mean, do you guys know how much New York City spends on every household? Anybody have an idea? And by the way, New York City households, 29% of them are single-person young households. It's $36,000 a household. You think you're getting $36,000 worth of service for that? We know you're not. So I just am aghast that everybody's talking about these great things that you're going to do, and I see no evidence of it. And, the apocalyptic, I think it's increasingly becoming clear that the apocalyptic rhetoric about climate control is probably misguided. I mean, if you ask me first of all, it's all at the end of this century. It's not in the next immediate years. And secondly, it seems to me if you don't control population, you can kiss off globally controlling climate. And if you are serious about it, I can tell you where the population problem is, because fertility is below replacement every place but in Africa. And by the end of the century, we're going to have 6 to 8 billion people. And short of a manufacturing global economy, it's going to be a huge challenge to providing decent incomes for those people. So that I think that, the notion that you're going to do all this great environmental stuff without addressing the fundamental problem is a joke.
Jason, do you have a question for Randy or for Bruce from what you've heard from them?
I mean, Bruce, you do what you can. Cutting the child poverty rate in half is a pretty big deal. And you just look on sort of a welfare weighted basis what it means to take money from someone, you know, who makes $1 million a year and give it to someone who makes $20,000 a year.
That's not the choice, Jason. You collect the money from the person who makes high income, and doing what you're doing with it now is wasting it. Now you're taking credit for that decline in the child poverty rate associated with government programs. But we know that there are vast differences across states and vast differences in the trends in state spending on that. And that doesn't show up at all as the state declines in or the relative state performances on child poverty.
Well, a lot of the child poverty measures you're looking at don't include those programs. And if you include a measure that doesn't include the program, it doesn't mean anything. You give a child allowance, which most other countries do. You write a check every month. You get it if you have a child. That's going to make a difference. The, you know, evidence is just mounting and mounting and mounting that, you know, you find somebody that was in preschool, that got housing vouchers, whatever else, you find them 30 years later, higher earnings, more likely to be employed.
Jason, if that were true, we would see it on a macro level, and we do not. That is, we would see the benefits of that in the overall levels of the economy. Those studies, and we both read them, are the result of a degree of data mining that's extraordinary.
There are dozens and dozens of these published in top journals by some of the best.
Exactly. And why has the aggregate performance of US students changed? Not at all.
Oh, I think when it comes to K through 12 education, that's not a matter of money. I agree with you.
No, but why is the
high quality schooling for 3 and 4 year olds? We're 20th in the OECD in the fraction of students enrolled. We spend very little on it. We can't solve the preschool problem without more money.
Jason, if you look across states and you look across in particular localities, there are vast differences in that amount of spending on preschool. It's increased over time. And yet the educational outcomes when the whole formal educational system gets done have not changed at all.
I'd rather look at more careful control and treatment, you know, paired counties.
You can do that, but when you don't see it, it means that the controlled treatments are not what happens when you implement the policy.
Well, I don't think we're going to convince each other of this topic. There's a lot more in there. I agree. I think that some of the money, like the manufacturing money, completely agree with you. I think that's backward looking. Don't think that will do very much for jobs growth or anything else. A lot of the other infrastructure, I think, is a good thing to do now and good for the future. But Randy, you want to come in?
Well, I think I'm much more with you. Our population has been largely neglected for a very long time by the federal government. And so your data on New York City, I think in part reflects that the federal government's not doing its job. And it has shifted responsibility to state and local governments that cannot afford to do a good job. Okay, so I think you're providing evidence in support of the federal government.
Randall, they're spending $36,000 per household per year, 40% of the households which get basically almost none of that. It's not the resources that are the problem in high tax states. It's that they are being spent in a way, and then I think it's increasingly clear in education. So the people in those states would rather have the money. And I don't, if I were to do this, what I would like to see the administration do is do a massive earned income tax credit and not try and spend the money itself, which 36,000, Randall, is a lot of money.
Well, so make the child allowance larger and shrink some.
Why not just
your argument?
Look, why encourage people to have kids? Why not do an earned income tax credit that takes care and rewards work at the bottom end of the income distribution and let it end there? Why do you want to interfere when the evidence for the interfering, and the most dramatic of this is the civil rights evidence, that after years and years and years, it's not clear that anything significantly beneficial has happened.
I think there's a good argument for the United States having a larger population. I don't know how sensitive that population is going to be to the child tax credit. Families with children have greater needs. This is something that every other country does. I think an EITC is great. Biden is proposing one, but I wouldn't limit myself to that, because you want a basic safety net for those even without earnings.
I think you want a basic safety net, and I agree, but I don't think you want to tie it to having kids. And I think there's compelling reasons for that. Climate related. And what you're trying to say is, oh, well, it doesn't affect how people have kids. Well, hard to say.
Well, I don't know if it affects it a lot. If it does, that's a plus, by the way. I'd be happy to find out.
You want more population?
In the United States, absolutely. It's a wonderful place for people to live.
If we really want more population, we should import it from places that have
I'm for that too.
much of less of an ability to deal with it.
I'm for
And I think, therefore, trying to do the kind of social engineering you're arguing for, Jason, is been, and again, the peak of this, look at the United States between 1964 and 1980. That was when this kind of thing was done on a large scale. You look at the state of the country in 1980 compared to 1964 on almost any measure, it's a disaster.
Hey, Bruce, I want to switch the subject, especially after the two of you agreed on the value of immigration. So Jason, we got a question here about doesn't it make sense for Congress to be concerned about the inflation impact of its fiscal policies? What would you say?
A few things. One is, they're not going to. There is no member of Congress. They don't meet every 6 weeks to scrutinize the data, predict what inflation will be, set a course for fiscal policy based on inflation. They just don't do that. No legislator in the world does. Number two, I don't think they ought to do that. I don't think they'd be very good at that job, and they're not very nimble. When you cut taxes, you're not going to raise them again, and then inflation goes down, you cut them again, and vice versa. And then finally, I think those of us that believe in fiscal policy can do many wonderful things. It can affect the distribution of income. It can affect our productivity. It can help us achieve other goals, whether it's climate change, saving lives, and the like. Let fiscal policy, which has lots and lots of textured instruments, do that, and then assign a very simple job to monetary policy, which is price stability and maximum employment. That's the way to free up fiscal policy to focus on what's important and let the Fed do this other, more technical, boring task.
Hey, Bruce, we've got a question from the floor about inflation in the service sector and what outlook you see for that.
Well, okay, I think that, look, I happen to agree with Jason on the threat of inflation. But I think that the mechanisms that are involved once you're in a service economy are very different from the traditional demand mechanisms that you see. So you don't backlog orders in services. I mean, hospitals don't handle the patients. The patients either get deferred till later, or they just, get used to living with whatever the condition is. Schools, it's not as if they run out of seats in schools. I mean, they adjust and the quality suffers, but it's a very different mechanism in manufacturers and automobiles and things like that. And I think, therefore, the connection between pricing and demand is very different in a service economy than it is in a manufacturing economy. Second thing I think is that, it's very different in a monopoly or oligopoly situation than it is in a competitive market. And I think that with the increasing degree of market power that you see in these smaller local markets, the mechanisms of inflation are very different. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to say is there is overwhelming evidence that monetary policy has no effect So if Jason really counts on monetary policy fixing an inflation, lots of luck, Jason. And I can actually give you an example of that to give you an idea of what's happened with the change in the structure of the banking system. If you look at old monetary policy, and here I'm thinking of the 1960s. In 1966, the Fed actually undertook a serious restriction in the growth of the money supply. 1967 is the year of the most rapid expansion of the Vietnam War, which is very aggressive fiscal policy. Nominal GDP growth in 1967 is below nominal GDP growth in 1966. That the power of monetary policy in those days was enormous. You look at what all the forecasts that have been made in the last 15 years by the Fed about the effect of monetary policy stimulating demand, none of it is materialized.
I certainly didn't think it was control of the money supply that was the most important part, but you talk about seeing in the data, large changes in the money supply over long periods of time are incredibly correlated with price changes across countries, but that wasn't what I had in mind. There's an
and the causality there is.
I'm not, but I'm not entirely sure. What do you think the Fed should be doing? Like,
I think the Fed is irrelevant at this point. And Joe and I wrote a paper in 1986 saying it was undermining its own power, and it seems to have been a pretty good forecast.
So they can just set interest rates at like half.
Well, all right, I'll give you an example of what I think. If you look, when Alan Greenspan was supposedly a genius in the 1990s, you can look at the effective monetary base multiplied by the reserve requirements, and it is all over the lot. He's expanding it, he's contracting it, he's doing all these things. You look at nominal GDP growth, it's essentially flat. And I think it's because once they changed the rules on interest rates on demand deposits, they disconnected the steering wheel, which is what he controls, from the wheels of the car, which is affecting the economy. So he's up there sitting in that car, moving the steering wheel around like crazy, thinking he's having a big effect, and the car just stays on the tracks because he's at Disneyland, not on the interstate highway system.
Hey, Randy, I've got two very different questions for you, but if you'd take them in succession, that'd be good. One, what do you think the Fed should be doing at this point? And then the second one, totally different from the floor, asking if you're arguing that the Biden administration proposed tax increases on corporations are misguided or just way too insufficient.
Okay, on the first, what should the Fed do? I like a low, stable interest rate. I agree with Bruce. They don't have the tools to fight inflation. I think that this is something fiscal policy should pay attention to. I don't mean that elected representatives ought to be projecting the inflationary impact of their policy. I think the CBO ought to be doing that. The scoring ought to be, how inflationary is this package likely to be? And then let's try to deal with it, okay? So that's the scope of fiscal policy. The Fed sets the overnight interest rate target. We've chosen to let them do that. I'm not sure it's a good idea, but that's the way we operate. And then they have many other responsibilities, lender of last resort, operating the payment system, making sure the treasury checks don't bounce. It does a good job at all those things. I would let them continue to do that. They're also supposed to regulate a large part of the financial system. They have not done a very good job at that. So that has been, I think, the major failing of the Fed since the days of Greenspan. Okay, I don't think the corporate profits tax is a very good tax. As I was arguing, it's shifted forward and backward. Exactly how much, we're not sure. Some of it is shifted onto the shareholders. But as I said, the biggest domestic holders are institutions. There are pension funds. Why are we trying to tax those? And then other not-for-profits that escape taxes, because that's our policy. They're holders, they're shareholders too. Why are we trying to tax them? So I just don't think it's a very well-designed tax. I don't think that it does a great job at reducing inequality for the reasons I just said, because it's not held by rich individuals to a large enough degree. The tax rates are probably not going to be high enough, and the amount shifted to them is not going to be high enough. So we're going to be hitting consumers forward and workers backward. Okay. So it doesn't work for inflation control. It doesn't work for inequality control. We do have to try to align international treatment of corporations. So this is a big problem if the US corporate tax rate is a lot higher than other places where corporations can move. That can be a problem. So there are just too many problems with it, and it's not a good tax. So I would not use it. I would not increase it. I would eliminate it.
So I strongly disagree with that. First of all, much of the corporate tax is falling on rents, on supernormal returns, on luck, on returns to monopoly power. It has a benefit for all of that. Second, people take into account everything you just said in terms of the pension funds holding it and the like, and do a distribution. And roughly 13% of it is paid by the bottom 60% of Americans. The top 0.1% of Americans, taking everything you just said into account, pay about twice as much of it, even though there are 1/600th as many of them. So it is a genuinely progressive tax. It also, we're also just not doing this on a blue sky. On a blue sky, I probably would have a corporate tax, by the way. I'd have expensing, so it would effectively be a little bit closer to a VAT than it would be to a corporate tax. But we're not doing this in a blue sky. And this is one of the places that there is broad agreement on getting revenue in a progressive manner, in a manner that would reduce inflation if you don't believe the Fed is doing anything. And so, I don't quite understand why you'd be arguing so strongly against a corporate.
Okay, I'm going to agree with Randall on this one. It's very hard to tell where the corporate tax resides. But here's the thing. There is no Henry Ibm who's IBM or William Amazon who's Amazon. Those are fictions. It is the places that money goes to human beings that you ultimately are concerned about and that you ultimately want to impose the taxes. So why fool around with this intermediate institution where you really, you got a lot of confidence in the economics profession, Jason, that given the record of the last few years seems to me is wholly misplaced. But these studies on where the tax goes are all over the lot. So why not tax people, not corporations?
Oh, you're taxing people by taxing corporations.
No, but it's an indirect way to do it.
Oh, I think there's uncertainty around who's paying the corporate tax, but there is no version of that uncertainty under which it isn't a very progressive tax, first of all. Second of all,
you don't know that, Jason.
Oh, I do know that, Bruce.
Well, you say that based on studies that are very ambiguous, that are not stable over time. Go ahead, Randall.
He's only looking at among the individual shareholders, it could be a progressive tax. But again, that's a smaller percent.
I was including the pensions and all that. I was including all that. What I said.
Look, impute the earnings to the shareholders and tax it.
Jason, I'm shocked that you want to do intermediate rather than sort of final income taxation. I thought that the theory of public finance was, especially if you care about the distribution.
I would add expensing and interest disallowance, which is very consistent with the theory of public finance. In fact, it looks an awful lot like a VAT, and it's collected at the level.
Do a VAT, which is really a tax on consumption and production. That you're affecting people. You're not affecting legal fictions.
That would be fine with me too. But again, we can have a blue sky conversation and we can have is it better or not to do blank proposal? the proposal in front of us, I think, is a pretty good one on corporate taxes. I'm perfectly comfortable with it. And yeah, of course you could find something even perfecter than it, but.
So I've got a sort of newsy question today, courtesy of some of my Reuters editors. Apparently there's been some talk about whether the debt limit ought to be permanently lifted. And wonder if you have views and whether or not that's even possible. Jason?
Yes, should be permanently lifted. I negotiated the debt limit with a McConnell staffer in 2011. After we both left government, we wrote an op-ed together saying we should do away with it. They want to do away with it effective 4 years from now, so we don't know who it'll affect when it's gone, which president will benefit. Could do that. I think it'd be better to get rid of it starting right away.
Do you see any prospect of that, chance of that happening?
Not a super high prospect of it happening right now, but I hope it does one day.
So yeah,
Yeah.
maybe you'll go out and argue for it again.
Yeah, I think that the debt is not the issue. The issue is the issue I think Randall raised, which is how resources get distributed. And that has to do much more with government spending than whether it's financed through the debt or it's financed through taxes.
Okay, gentlemen, what is sitting here on the table still left to be sorted out?
Well, can I say something that alarms me a little bit about this discussion? And I'm now going to channel Bob Solo, which is that when you talk about the distribution of income, there's the high end and there's the low end. I think we care about the low end. And the discussion should be focused on whether and I think an earned income tax credit is the best way to do it, raising incomes at the low end. I think people who've concentrated on the high end, notably in Zimbabwe and in Venezuela, have done much worse than people like Lula in Brazil who've concentrated on the low end. So if I were to give you an advice on the income inequality, as I say, I would worry about helping the low end of that distribution much more than I'd worry about punishing the high end. Because ultimately punishing the high end, it's too mobile and you're just going to waste your time.
I strongly agree with that. I think the high end is largely high end because of its contributions to our economy and innovation. I think we should focus, and our social welfare functions should primarily be about what we do at the bottom. I don't think anything in the range of what Biden has proposed is punitive. He didn't frame it as punitive when he gave his joint address, and it would leave us very far from the economic policies pursued by Zimbabwe, appropriately so.
I agree. We need to focus on the bottom, raise incomes at the bottom, increase pay and jobs at the bottom. I do think we need to do something about the top, but I don't think taxes are a very good way. Very hard to get it through Congress, very hard to enforce, mobile, lots of reasons why it's hard to do it with taxes. I think you have to put in place barriers to earning those kinds of incomes through monopoly rents. In other words, stop the generation of that kind of income rather than trying to take it away once it's been generated.
It's going to be really hard because these are natural monopolies.
It can be hard. I agree.
Okay, I'm going to ask if each of you have any closing lines for the last few minutes, and then maybe there's a minute left. Dimitri can come on and plug things for tomorrow. And I thank you guys for making this our last act of the day a lively session. So, Jason, got anything to wrap up with here?
I think there was probably less commonality with Bruce, but there's some big differences in theory that we have here. I think a decent amount of calmness about inflation over the short term. I have a lot of uncertainty about it. Over the medium and long term, I don't think anyone thinks it's the main objective or thing that we need to be concerned about. And I think you want to invest wisely and do things that have a high rate of return. And I'd be happy to have Bruce on the committee of people to scrutinize everything to make sure we're kicking the tires, because that money is well used. But I certainly think we need, I don't think we can do without a lot of that investment, but I have no doubt we could do better or worse versions of it.
Bruce, last words?
Well, this is one I've wanted to say for a long time. I absolutely agree with Jason on inflation. Both in the short term, it being very uncertain because we're in an unusual economic environment in terms of historical inflation, and in the long run, it not being a concern.
Okay, I'll just quickly say something about the sustainability, the math of the sustainability. It starts from the presumption there's some natural interest rate out there, but actually the interest rate is completely under control of the central bank, and that there's some natural growth rate out there that may not be fixed, but there at any point in time. And once you get the interest rate above the growth rate, everything's unsustainable. Okay, but that's also based on the presumption that the growth of the deficit and the debt ratio don't impact those variables. The one that they're likely to impact is the growth rate. That is why we never have the deficit ratio continually climb and the debt ratio continually climb to 1,000%. The reason is because the growth rate changes, which changes the government's balance, so that it's self-limiting. These are all endogenous variables. And so this simple mathematical exercise, let's carry everything to infinity and suppose that somehow the interest rate remains above the growth rate for an infinite number of years, is a completely wasteful enterprise.
Thank you. Dimitri, you want to take us out of here and set us up?
Well, let me just say this was a pretty terrific panel. We like this type of debates, especially if there are both agreements and disagreements, because then Minsky, I think, would be right to have to say that this conference, which he established 30 years ago, actually it served its purpose. So I want to thank you all very, very much. We start tomorrow, the second day at 10 o'clock. And again, we begin with a president of a Federal Reserve to set the stage for the rest to follow. So again, thank you very, very much. And I look forward to seeing you next year as well.